Okay.
All right, Frank, it's February 10th. It's been one heck of a 2024, and I'm honored to be here. So if you could, for our viewers, this is the first time, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from?
I grew up on Long Island in New York. I was born in 1945. My family, uh, half came from Italy, the other half came from Ireland. Um, uh, my family left Long Island in 1995. Was pretty difficult when my father sold the family home, but it was his house. So I was gone by then, obviously. I went to Catholic school all my life. I went up at the University of San Francisco, graduated in 67. I was in the Army by 68, and I was in Vietnam a year later after flight school.
Well,
Um, Go ahead.
it's first of all, it's impressive the quick turnaround for graduating and then being in the army and then of course going to Vietnam. But I was curious, born in 1945, did you have any family members that served in World War II?
My dad was a B-24 pilot he flew out of, I think he was in Calcutta, actually. And they were bombing Japanese freighters in Rangoon Harbor. And it's hard to imagine a B-24 skip bombing ships, but that's what they were doing. So they were coming across low level and dropping and skipping bombs like you were skipping a stone across the water into, they act like torpedoes practically and blow up Japanese freighters in the harbor. Um, my dad was a high school graduate, went to Jamaica High School, and decided he wanted to go flying. So he did. And it always amazed me because he was one of these guys that needed malpractice insurance if he picked up a screwdriver. But somehow he managed. And there was a fellow in his squadron that was flying for Trans World Airlines prior to the war. And this guy's name was Frank Smith. And he said to my dad, among others, um, when you get home, not if, but when, um, get a hold of me and I'll get you a job at Trans World Airlines. And so my dad was hired by Trans World Airlines. His date of hire was August 6th of 1945. That's when he was on the seniority list. And it was just shy of his 26th birthday, like
Wow.
about 3 days.
Now, do you know how many
So
missions your dad flew in the Pacific?
I do not. I don't. My dad never talked about any of this. I have years later, he wrote a 3-page letter addressed to me and my siblings. And this is ostensibly what I did in World War II. The letter dealt with a guy that toggled his bomb load on takeoff. And my father was an airfield commander that particular day. Fortunately, the bombs didn't go far enough to arm, but they called his guy's nickname was Two Gun McCoy because he carried two pistols. That was most of the story that he related in these 3 pages. And then he proceeded to tell us about how he smuggled my mother on a troop train from New York to Tucson. And that was the extent of his World War II stories. I know it was a lot worse than that, but like most men of his generation, he didn't speak about it. And so you could you would get answers to questions that skirted around the periphery of what you were asking, but nothing ever went directly to the heart of what it must have been like to be there. In my entire career, Army and with the airline, my dad talked to me about flying 3 times, and that was it. And he always offered just a very little bit of advice, but we just didn't talk about the war. He did ask me about Vietnam once out of the clear blue when we were up in Alaska, and I told him the truth, and then made him cry. But that's that they were a closed shop. These guys, these World War II veterans.
That's how my grandfather was. He spoke some. The older he got, the more he would tell. But I know that there's certain stories that I was never able to hear, just because you're right. These guys did bottle it up until, for many of them, it was too late.
I had in my desk when I was in front of my desk when I was growing up, living at home, and while I was in high school, my father's two medals hung over my desk. One was a Distinguished Flying Cross, and the other one was an Air Medal. And I remember asking him one night how he got them. And he proceeded to tell me an entirely different story about how he had to tell my grandfather, my Irish grandfather, how my father was going to resign his commission and go to work for the airline, and my grandfather's reaction to it. But that's as close as we got to how he got those medals. He never talked about it. Wow. And I had to laugh because I had something made, and in what I had made was a picture of printed on fabric of an Air Medal, a Distinguished Flying Cross, and a Bronze Star. And I remember my brother Terry sending me asking me on the phone, where'd you get Dad's medals? And I laughed and I said, they're not Dad's, Terry, they're mine. And he was just dumbstruck. He think they gave you those?
Well, I mean, it's phenomenal too. A lot of the Vietnam veterans that I've interviewed, of course, the inspiration for many of them comes from their fathers, their uncles, older brothers who were in World War II or Korea. And
Yeah.
so, and it's interesting to see the paths that how many of the Vietnam veterans followed in their fathers or older siblings' footsteps in the same branch and almost in the same line of work.
Well, for me, Zach, I when I was 11 years old in the beginning of the sixth grade, my father came to school and picked me up early, and I went with him in the cockpit of a Connie, of Lockheed Constellation. Do you know what that is?
No, sir.
It's a yeah, TWA. And at any rate, my dad was the captain, and I rode in the cockpit. And we went to Columbus, Ohio, and back. And I rode in the cockpit of that airplane. We flew right over Forbes Field in Pittsburgh, and the Dodgers, Jackie Robinson, Pee Wee Reese, are playing the Pittsburgh Pirates. And the flight engineer said, "You want to listen to the game?" I said, "No." And I mean, I was a diehard Dodger fan as a little kid, but I had no interest in this. I wanted to see what was going on here with my dad, who was flying this airplane, and I remember flying back to LaGuardia, coming across and seeing the skyline of New York, and all I could see was a Chrysler building lit up, and I thought, looking at that building to this day, every time I see it, I think everything's right with the world. But I realized then that the only thing I ever wanted to do in my life was fly airplanes. That was it.
I can remember my
When
first flight. My dad was in the Air Force, and so he worked on F-15s in the 80s, but he loved flying. And at our local airport, he hooked me up with one of his buddies who had a Beechcraft. And I remember the first time that I was allowed to fly. I was maybe 8 or 9, and just going up and as a little kid, seeing the world get a little smaller as you get higher, and being able to fly over your town or see the lake from 1,000 feet, or when he takes it into a moderately tight turn and you feel that kind of little leap in your stomach. Oh, it was the greatest feeling I ever had. I absolutely fell in love with it.
it was a marvelous experience. As far as the military went with my family, my mother watched her husband, who wasn't her husband yet. Well, actually, they did get married before he left. But my dad and her two brothers go off to war. My father, one of the things we did he did tell me about flying later on was that the Army Air Corps taught him just enough to kill himself. And he said the rest of it he learned on his own. And he said that's what military training is going to be like for you. It's going to be barely enough. And then when after my first 2 years at the University of San Francisco, and I realized the gigantic academic hole that I had dug for myself because I was not exactly going to college when I was in college. I had this monstrous hole to dig out of. So when I realized how things were going in Southeast Asia, I knew that when I graduated, and I was going to graduate because I became a genius in my junior year, and I had no idea that I was a genius, but I became one, and the I knew that I wasn't going to get into graduate school. And so there was no way for me to avoid the draft. The minute I stepped off that stage with the diploma in my hand, the draft board is going to be tapping me on the shoulder. So I thought, well, I'm going to go join ROTC because I can get a better deal here. I'll be an officer and I can figure out what I want to do. And so I did. I did, but I didn't tell my parents. At Christmas time in my junior year, I had not started ROTC yet, and I hadn't had a haircut since the beginning of my sophomore year. So I had these long flowing locks, and I'm in San Francisco. I mean, I've got rose-colored glasses and love beads and whole shit match. My father comes to pick me up at Christmas. I took the all-nighter to New York from San Francisco, and I'm standing out in front of TWA terminal with my hair in a ponytail and love beads and the whole shit match. And the car comes around. I see him, and he slows down, but he doesn't stop, and he keeps going. I'm thinking, okay, now what? There were no cell phones then, so how was I going to call mom? But he comes around again, and he gets out of the car. And he goes, "What are you supposed to be?" So off we go. Get back to school. ROTC starts. I get a haircut. Go through the second semester of my junior year, started the ROTC program, come back in the spring. I've got a short Army haircut. My father, this time when he comes to pick me up, he stops and he looks at me and he goes, "What?" And I said, I'll tell you when we get home. He knew what I'd done. I mean, he knew it just by looking at my head. And so we got home and I explained to my parents how I felt, that I wasn't going to get into graduate school, that I'd made a mess of this, but I could figure it out. But I just had to get a little space between me and being a grunt infantry, 11 Bravo, carrying a rifle in a jungle. So most parents would be understanding. Mine weren't. My father was furious. I thought he was going to kill me. And he steamed out of the room, just one goddamn it after another. And my mother, I mean, I was her golden boy, and which drove my siblings crazy, but I was her golden boy. She rolled off and belted me so hard across the face, I'm sure it was not me over. And I thought, whoa, this didn't go like I thought it was gonna. And so we had a truce, sort of, until it came time for me to go to ROTC summer camp. Then they wouldn't take me to the airport. So I had to get a friend to take me. And when I graduated from college and I was getting ready to report to Fort Knox for Armor Officer Basic, I didn't think they were going to take me then. And we drove to the airport at LaGuardia. I had to go to Cincinnati. And I don't think we said 3 words to one another. It was that tense.
Wow.
It was just, I mean, no kidding. And they never got used to it. They never got used to it. My dad was so angry the whole time. And when I was in Vietnam, they were very supportive. And I got letters and stuff, but they were just pissed. They were pissed that I'd done it.
That is the
It was real.
first. You're the first veteran I've interviewed, and I've interviewed quite a few Vietnam veterans that's actually had this story of the parents being unsupportive of your decisions and vehemently angry and upset about it. That's very intriguing, especially perhaps considering what your father had done, 20 years prior.
Who can know? Who can know? Um, we we come from a long line of Roosevelt Democrats. And one of the other things my father told me when I got hired by the airline, he said, "Listen, boy," he said, "you don't discuss politics in that cockpit. You keep your mouth shut." He said, "Because you're not going to win, and and you're not going to make many friends." And so I just, swallowed my tongue most of the time, never said a word. These guys were my dad's contemporaries when I first started. It was so interesting to be around them. And they didn't talk about the war, but it was the way they carried themselves and how they related to one another. The only guy I knew the whole time I was flying in the military that had any connection to World War II was an instructor of mine. And I never knew his first name. His name was Weaver. And I had him in the second phase of primary flight school at Fort Stewart, Georgia, flying a 172, a Cessna 172 is what they used for training then. And he had a pencil thin mustache, and his hair was slicked back iron like this. He wore it like this. He chain smoked camels, and his flight glove was stained orange. I mean, it was bright orange from the nicotine. And he was the best instructor I've ever had. He did stuff that was so clever, and how he taught. When I wound up teaching after I came back from Vietnam, I remembered the way he acted. Anyway, 3 weeks with Weaver, and I worked my ass off, and it was the best flying lessons I have ever gotten. But the whole time that I was in the cockpit with him, his head was doing this. Finally, I screwed up the courage to ask him, "Mr. Weaver, what are you looking for?" And he looked at me with a smile and he said, "Messerschmitts, kid, Messerschmitts." Turns out he was a P-38 pilot over Italy. And so yeah, he'd be looking for Messerschmitts down in Georgia, just below Savannah. We're looking for Messerschmitts. God knows where they come from, but they were there.
And God knows how you're going
I
to get
love
away from one in a 172.
Ow, you weren't. I loved it. I just thought that was just marvelous. And obviously I've never forgotten it. It's just one of those things. It was funny, and it's one of those things that stays with you. Um, it's just a slice of life and a slice of flying that you just don't forget.
It's my dad's being former Air Force, of course, put me into connections with a lot of his former friends. And when I was a kid, I know this is going to sound probably ridiculous, but we played a online flight simulator, and through that, I met two amazing individuals who were career fighter pilots. One flew F4s and F-15s throughout the late 70s and into the 90s. The other one flew F-14s throughout the late 80s and into the 90s. And being able to pick their brain as I got older about the specifics of flying, angles of attack, and their careers in very prestigious squadrons was one of the most amazing memories I've had of talking to fighter pilots. It's incredible. Fighter pilots are a knack. Pilots in general are the most interesting people I think I've ever met because you're taking a plane up, defying the laws of gravity, and doing something absolutely crazy with it. So I love pilots.
It was flying for the airline, especially at the end of my career, was the most fun you could possibly have and get paid. I mean, it was just ridiculous. I loved it. I loved every minute of it. And if I could have stayed, because we had to retire at age 60, and I was just, I was desolate. I mean, my heart was broken. I told the flight attendant on my last trip, when we pull into the gate, I'm getting off first. And when we taxi in here, you're not going to see fire trucks with water hoses going and all that stuff celebrating my last flight. There's nothing to celebrate. I'm getting off first, and you're not to say anything to anyone because I don't want these people to know it's my last flight. And don't trap me in this cockpit because if you do and the door is open, these people are going to see me crying. I got to get out of here. She was very good. She let me go out the door.
Oh, well, and to get back on this, friend, point being, I mean, flying's been a big part of your life. I mean, you've even wrote a book about it. So, and that's what I was going to get into well, let's talk about Vietnam. When did you first hear about Vietnam when you were in your teenage years?
Actually, I didn't hear about it in my teenage years. I was graduated from high school in '63, and that's when it began. So we were cognizant of some of it. Special forces were brand new. Kennedy had gotten started that. I heard about it probably in the beginning of or the end of my freshman year of college. And that's when it became obvious to me that something was going on here. And it wasn't, it was the unpopularity of it was building. And so we had people come to the school and talk about it. Um, and it was all very anti-war. Um, and the crescendo was building. Um, but like I said, there's some things that are inevitable and you know it. And so that's what you do. But that's when I first heard about
And so, hearing about it, and I'm of course sure you had friends that got drafted or volunteered well before you did, and building up to it, we get to ROTC, and you realize, at least you're going to stand a better chance of going into this as an officer. What were you learning in ROTC?
nothing, not a thing. Go march. It was just goofy. And we did a couple of night exercises over at Fort Baker across the Golden Gate Bridge. But it was just you're filling up a square. And the tactics that I learned um, were tactics from World War II. They had no application to Vietnam. And so I thought, well, what's the point? No, I didn't learn anything in ROTC. I got a commission as a second lieutenant, and I made $30 a month while I was doing it.
Well, and $30 a month is $30 a month, especially in this time
Right.
period.
Yeah, exactly.
And
Exactly.
so ROTC comes to an end, and then you yourself end up in Army Officer Basic, or Armor Officer Basic. What were you learning in Basic for armor?
How to drive a tank. It was great fun. You did learn some tactics, but again, this was all geared to Europe. It had no application to Vietnam. And because you're talking about now, um, 68, and we'd been in Vietnam for 5 years, and the scheme of things had changed, and it changed, and it changed, and the regimes had changed, and so it always seemed like everything in Vietnam was in a state of flux. So Armor Officer Basic, there was nothing there that I can remember that applied. And I kept thinking to myself while I was there, I'd be driving a tank down the middle of a road in if you wind up in South Vietnam and you're in this tank, and you're going to be driving over a buried howitzer round or some damn thing. It just it made no sense to me. And while I was at Fort Knox in Armor Officer Basic, I decided that this is my chance to go to flight school and learn how to fly. And so first thing I did was I took the test, and then I took my physical. And when I had them both passed, then I applied to flight school. And I had to make a phone call to DC, to the Armor Branch, and because I didn't want to go fly helicopters, and I wanted to fly fixed wing like my dad. And so I called his colonel and I explained all this to him, and he knew I was lying, but he listened to me anyway. And he said, "Well, why do you want to go to fixed wing? My father was in the Army Air Corps, blah blah blah." He said, "What does your father do now? He's an airline pilot." "Well, you're not going to learn enough to be an airline pilot with the training we're going to give you in the Army." And I said, "I don't care. I will go to rotary wing school after I finish a tour in Vietnam in flying fixed wing." And I think he knew that was a big fat lie too, but he relented and he let me go, and so I that's how I got to flight school. And it I just I didn't want to walk, and when I took a look at how tanks were being used and what I'd be doing in it, and they could tell me I was going to Germany, but I knew that was not going to happen. I was going to Vietnam. I thought, I don't want to be in that tank. So I want the best deal I can get. I'm going to be flying. And that's what I did. And I got my orders, and I called home and told my parents, and now they were even angrier. And but I, but I told them I, my dad was actually pretty reasonable, and I said I'm gonna have to give it up. I'm gonna have to be in an extra 2 years. So instead of being able to get out in 2 years, I'm going to be in for 4 after I finish flight school. I'll have to do 2 extra years. So as it wound up, I was in the Army for like 4 years and 7 months, something like that. But I got to go to fixed wing, and I made the most of it.
Now, did they immediately pull you out of armor officer basic school, or did you have to graduate first, then go to flight school?
I had to finish that, and then because they had some time between when I finished and when I was supposed to go to flight school, they sent me to motor officer school.
Oh
And I
God, how
thought,
was that?
Jesus, just shoot me, you know. I remember standing telling this colonel, I said, I have orders to flight school. I don't know what I'm doing here. I said, I don't like cars anyway. I mean, I like a driver. I still like a fixer. And it's not something I've ever wanted to do. So, but he was a lieutenant, just show up and shut up. So I said, okay, I will.
Now, how long did you end up staying here at the motor school?
I think it was like about 6 weeks. And I I wound up getting to flight school in the early summer of '68 down south of Savannah at Fort Stewart, Georgia, Camp Swampy. And
That's hot
that's
time
where
of the
we,
year too.
you know, holy smokes. So anyway, there we were. And I I got after we finished at Fort Stewart, we went to Fort Rucker, and at Rucker we went and got an instrument rating, which was great. That was the best deal going. And I got an instrument rating, a real one, not a tactical rating, which the helicopter guys got. This was the real deal. They signed my card, said I was instrument qualified, and we did it in a Baron, so we got a multi-engine rating, and I thought that was terrific. And from there, we went to Bird Dogs, and I learned how to fly it. And then I went through another couple of weeks of tactics, and and then they said, "You want to leave? You want to take a leave of 30 days before you go to Vietnam?" And I said, "No, let's go get this damn thing over with." So in the early September, I was on my way.
Well, with that quick turnaround, I mean, that is incredibly fast paced for flight school. So when you're in flight school, I mean, what sticks out to you when you're learning how to fly these Cessnas and small prop planes?
Um, in the beginning, the first phase of flight school, the initial flight training, it was two parts at Fort Stewart. So the first half and second half. First half was great fun. I had a great instructor, and I really loved it. And then I went and got into the second half, and I had a guy that had just come back from Vietnam, and we hadn't even strapped into the airplane. And he said to me, "You know, they didn't kill me in Vietnam, and I'm not going to let you kill me here." And I thought, I thought, I haven't done anything. I haven't even put the seatbelt on yet. And all of a sudden, I'm going to kill you. The guy showed me nothing, absolutely nothing. And so everything that I learned in that phase, I taught myself. Unfortunately, there were a couple of things I didn't teach myself very well. And so I wound up getting a check ride with a guy named Arlie Deaton. He was a major. And Deaton said to me, "Did anybody show you how to do these two particular maneuvers?" And I said, "No." I said, "I was shown them in the airplane, but I never got to fly them. And the instructor did them, but he never explained them. And so all I did was watch." And he said, "You didn't have your hands on the controls and your feet on the foot pedals, and so you could feel this as you." And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, this is how you do this." So he did one and I did one. I did it just fine. So we did the next maneuver, and he showed me how to do it. He did one, I did one, and did it just fine. We get back in the land, and he said, "I can't pass you." I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because I can't teach you on a check ride." He said, "But you're going to be a good pilot. And so I'm going to see to it that you get recycled because you got a raw deal here." And so I did. I repeated the phase again. And that's when I ran into Mr. Weaver with the slick back hair and measurements. But now it was easy. Deaton shows up in April of 1970 as my company commander.
Wow.
I hadn't seen him, so he gives me a check right now. He's my company commander. He looks at me and goes, "I know you." So, and Arlie and I were friends until he died. I talked to him almost once a week,
Wow.
and we were always very close. And I remember a friend of mine called me and said Arlie was not well from diabetes. I called him on the phone, and his answer phone picked up, and I said, "This is Frank Doherty, and remember that check ride you flunked me on?" And then I hung up, and then I thought, "No, wait a minute, so I picked the phone back up again. I said, "Well, let me rephrase that. This is Captain Frank Doherty, and for Delta Airlines, and I'm again reminding you about the." And I hung up, and then I called him back a third time right after that. I said, "I didn't say enough there. This is Delta Airlines 767 Captain Frank Doherty." And I'm telling you, bam, 2 seconds later, the phone rings. It's him. And he said, "You're a success because of me." He said, "You would have never passed any of that if it hadn't been for me." And I said, "You're absolutely right. Well, my daughters are listening to all this and they're dying with laughter." And I looked at him and I said, "Now we're going to have to sing Ruby at the top of our lungs. Ruby, don't take your love to town," because that was Arlie's favorite song. We sang it every night when I was with him in Pleiku. And sure enough, we crank up and we're singing Ruby. And I thought my girls were going to wet their pants. They were laughing so hard. But anyway, it's flight school. One last thing about flight school, and this is important, and it's a shame. In tactics, the very last phase of pilot training in a bird dog, nobody showed you how to fly in combat. Nobody talked about how to avoid getting shot at or hit or killed. You went out and you flew around and navigated and did little cross countries and low level bullshit, but no one ever showed you the way to make bullets miss. Nobody ever said to you, keep your wheels in the treetops. None of that stuff. So when I got to Vietnam, I asked a couple of questions from a guy that I just talked to yesterday, John Myers, and I said, "How do I make the bullets miss?" And he said, "Fly crooked." And I said, "Well, I can do that. I'm good at that." And so all he's talking about is cross controlling. So just like you would land in a crosswind
Yep.
with the wind down, okay, and using opposite rudder to keep the drift, you do that when you're flying straight ahead. Nose is going this way, the airplane's going this way. NVA they're gonna aim out here, but you're going like this. So everything is going over here most of the time. And sometimes they hit you, but they hit the airplane and missed me. But the idea was to keep you're tracking sideways, so everything is going over here or over here, depending upon how you're cross controlling. You never, never, never climb away from ground fire. No one ever explained that. So the idea of dragging your wheels in the trees made eminent sense. Your rate of closure over the ground was quicker than if you were up here. Walk outside and watch a little airplane fly by. If he's up at 1,000 feet or 2,000 feet, it takes him a while to go across your line of sight. If he's right down on the treetops, he's gone. The other thing is, when you stayed low on the tops of the trees, if they had 50s that were mounted on tripods, or they could be in a gun emplacement, they couldn't depress those barrels low enough. So they were firing through the trees. and that offered you some protection as well. The only thing you needed to remember when you were dragging your wheels into trees was that when you made a turn, you never put your wing down and
Right.
made a normal turn. Never. Because that wingtip's catching a tree limb and you're going in. So you made a big pedal turn and you skidded around the turn. But nobody ever explained any of that. So, I
Well,
mean, there were things. Go ahead. Sorry.
no, you're fine, Frank. No worries. Don't let me interrupt. But I mean, learning all that in a combat zone, I mean, some people don't learn fast enough and they die. They go down.
You could be the greatest pilot since Chuck Yeager, and fly one handed and tie your shoe with the other, and everybody else's shoes at the same time. If you and it was just luck, and one of the worst pilots in the world could show up and he would survive and go home because he was just lucky. You flying a bird dog, flying this little airplane was like putting on a shoe. Once it's on your foot, you don't think about it. So I never had to say hands do this and feet do this. I just did it, and so the airplane was an extension of me. The rest of the tactics stuff, this was stuff that I discussed with the guys that I flew this mission with. Um, Kind of learning on the job training, on the job training, and
Well,
that's true.
and it's just so surprising as well. I mean, by the time that you're going through training, though, I mean, we're looking at what, 1968? I mean,
Yeah,
69? I mean, thinking about that, bird dogs have been in service. I mean, you've had recon, you've had this, and there's no combat training of how it's going to be worked in country.
nope,
Wow.
none.
And it brings up a further question too. In training, when you're in tactics, how are they teaching you to approach target areas?
What target areas?
Let's say that, you've been given oh, I see what you're getting now.
No, what you learned how to do was not get lost flying low level. The other thing you learned how to do, and the only thing that the tactics ever got applied to in an explanation of this maneuver was to make a low level. They called it a tactical approach to landing. So you came across the trees, chopped the power, flaps went down, put the airplane on the ground. That was it. That was it. Period. That was tactics. We didn't even fly our rockets. I didn't fire a rocket till I got to Vietnam, and the airplane had no sight, so I used a grease pencil mark on the windshield as my my gun sight. But no, I didn't fire a rocket till I got there.
Well, even the fact of the gun sights and having to apply that yourself, I mean, that too also takes learning on the job of figuring out, well, what range do you fire the rocket and where's it going to impact?
All of that, all of it, and if you did something really dumb and you punched a rocket off at a target that was right in front of you, all of a sudden the light bulb goes off and says, "Oh crap! I'm going to fly right through what I just fired at," and all that stuff is coming up off the ground. It none of that was explained. Zero, nada, zilch,
Wow.
none.
Well, and looking back on it now, Frank, from your standpoint, I mean, it's a wonder that anyone survived flying bird dogs with this little to no training of how it applies in combat.
If in the course of the war, Zach, half of the bird dogs that were in Vietnam were destroyed, and half of the guys that flew it, and I think they were like a little under 300 pilots for all the services that had O1 bird dog. Half of them were dead. The the thing that I did flying for the special forces in a very secret war, um, there were only between 12 and 16 guys that flew it, and 16 be a lot over the course of the war for this one group that we supported. And half of them, I think there were, let's say there were 13 guys that flew that mission. There maybe were, I believe there were 5 or 6 that were killed.
Mm.
And so, it was the job could be the job could be very dangerous depending upon what you were doing. And flying in country was not nearly as dangerous as what we were doing. And I fully expected that I would either get shot down and killed or wounded. And fortunately, I was not shot down and I did not get wounded. Excuse me 1 minute. I'll be right back.
Right. Anytime, my friend. And what I was going to do is that you mentioned the casualty figures. I mean, we're looking at easily 50% casualty rate just among the bird dogs and along the total pilots. I mean, that's astronomical.
Yeah. Well, the airplane came into the inventory in 1947. It was the first all-metal liaison aircraft or reconnaissance aircraft that the Army ever had. The other ones were Pipers, and they were fabric. So this one was the first all-metal one, but it was unarmed, and it had 2 rocket tubes under each wing, but there were no other guns on it. And I carried a 38, and I carried a Car 15 with a collapsible stock that I could bungee to the right-hand door. Yep, that's it. That's me.
I thought this
That's
would
a
be
bird.
great for the viewers, many of whom have perhaps ever heard of a bird dog. But I mean, in the photograph, if you look close enough, you can see the rockets right under each wing, as mentioned.
Yep, there are 2 of them there, and the guy in the back seat I think is Mike Buckland, and that's me in the front seat. And my wingman Phil Phillips, whom I just spoke with the other day, took the photograph.
Now,
We were doing a dual.
go ahead, my friend.
We did a dual ship mission. Well, that's what we flew a lot of them over into Laos. Sometimes we flew solo, but if I had Mike in the back, Buckland was a photographer. And so we were doing our most favorite hated mission, which was a low-level photo mission. Could have been bomb damage assessment or something, but we were down in the weeds taking pictures.
Now, would the backseater be taking the photographs, or did you have a
Yeah,
camera? Okay.
no, he did all that. I did the driving, he did the photograph.
Well, and for viewers, I mean, to get a good photograph for a BDA or of whatever you've been assigned to photograph, you got to be low. The lower you are, the better the photograph.
We operated if in this case, since Buckland was in the backseat of my airplane, I was the low ship. Phil was flying cover for me. Phil was probably at 500 feet, and I was on the trees. You had to get down because if you were looking straight down, there were a lot of things you couldn't see. There's some things you could see, but for the most part, looking right straight down on top of the canopy, you didn't see the things you needed to see. So you needed to get so that you could see between the layers of leaves. And you try to keep the sun at your back and do this early in the morning so the slant rays of the sun lit up the ground. And it was just nobody told me that in flight school either. but this is what we did. And so that was the airplane, and probably on that mission, I had white phosphorus rockets loaded in the rocket in the tubes, and the white phosphorus we used for marking when the white phosphorus hit the ground and the round went off, the smoke from that was able to go up through the canopy. A smoke grenade wasn't dense enough, and it would just sort of lay on the ground. This one would go up and we could see it.
Wow.
So anyway,
Well, I mean, with that as well, speaking just how low you're flying, and I think it's important for viewers to understand how thick the triple canopy really is in that
Yeah.
part of the world. I mean, I've had plenty of veterans tell me. I just recently interviewed Terry Kadenbach, who was with Hatchet Force in itself, and
No, I know Terry.
Terry's
I know
great.
Terry.
Terry's awesome.
Yeah.
He told the
Yeah.
same thing. He said, that a smoke grenade is just gonna spread out throughout the canopy, and he said it might pop out a kilometer away, but he said a white phosphorus that's gonna go up.
Yeah. So that's why we used them.
Well,
You know,
and getting to it as well, I mean, with the bird dogs, I mean, I know for a fact you don't need a 10,000-foot runway to land a bird dog. So, what length of a runway could you land and take off with a bird dog?
I could probably put that thing down in I would say I would have more than enough at 400 feet of
Wow.
runway. And I could probably land it in shorter than that. And the it was not difficult to do. It just took a little bit of concentration, but that bird dog had 60 degrees of flaps. So that's a lot of flaps. So it gets pretty damn slow. And if you had just enough power to maintain a controlled descent of about 500 feet a minute, you could literally come down like this and then flare, chop the power, flare, the thing had touched down, and you were kind of stopped.
Wow. That's incredible. I mean,
You could take off the same way. It would take it had plenty of power, and you 200 horse Lycoming, I think, is what we were using, but you could put all 60 degrees of flaps down and stand on the brakes, push the thrust lever, the throttle up to takeoff power, pop the brakes, and keep the stick sucked back. You'd start that and then let the stick go, and this airplane would literally, it wouldn't even, the nose wouldn't even come up. It would just come off the ground. And if you just had to pay attention to that tail wheel and make sure that you were correcting for wind. And as long as you were honest about your crosswind uh, technique, you're going to be fine. And it wasn't that big a bugaboo, that tail wheel, but it would just literally softly come off the ground. It was very cool.
well, one of the things that catches my attention is with how many degrees of flaps it has, and with the speed, you can turn that on a dime.
Yeah, you could. If you when you set up, for instance, to fly into Laos and you wanted to get down on the trees, so you could, do big lazy turns going down, but you were making a wide circles and it took a while. Or you could come above your target and pull a chop the power, pull a stick all the way back and jam right rudder to it, or left rudder, doesn't matter. But if you jammed right rudder to it with the stick all the way back and the power off, this thing's going to flip over in its back, and then it's going to go into a spin. And so now the nose is coming down, and you're going around and around like this, and you're coming down fast. You're hard to hit, and then all you had to do to recover from this was let go of the stick, and it stopped all by itself, stopped spinning. And then as you picked up speed, so you begin to give yourself a little back pressure on the stick, and up the nose would come, and then you could add power, and there you were on the trees, right where you wanted to
Incredible.
be. Yeah, it was great. It was fun to do. So you know it it it, uh, it worked in all situations. I mean, nobody could be shooting at you. Somebody could be shooting at you and doing what we were doing. They usually were. So get down on a tree.
Well, I have to ask, while you were in training, learning to fly the bird dog, and of course flying, Like many of the pilots I've interviewed at some points in their careers, whether they were in fighters, attack aircraft, or even helicopters, a lot of them like to mock dogfight. So, did you ever do any mock dogfighting in the bird
Oh,
dog?
hell yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah. We always had a couple of Air Force guys going out with us, and they were flying the Cessna Skymasters. That we call them the Mix Masters, the props in the front, engine in the front, engine in the back. They weren't that maneuverable, but these guys were Coveyfax. So they were going out in support of the teams on the ground. Um, and so we'd pretty much be going out to an area together for some missions. And inevitably, one of those butt heads would attack us. And the next thing you know, you hear this guy going bang, 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 and he's over the radio. And so I'd look over and there, now it started. And it was just, but if there were two bird dogs going out and there were two coveys going out, only one bird dog and one covey engaged. Those guys had to keep going, get out of the way, because we need a little space to tumble around. But it was fun, and sometimes I won, sometimes they won. It just who snuck up on who first. That way.
Well, and two, in these aircraft that you can fly at treetop level, you can buzz around in them, you can have the infinite amount of fun in a bird dog. I mean, and when you're in your mid-20s, it's the time of your life.
It was. We the only thing you were always we were always cognizant of the amount of risk involved in what we were doing. And, you know, flying to the target was a time where you could look out the window and look at the terrain and look at how beautiful it was. And it lets you put your finger on that which made you human. It lets you put your finger on your ability to still recognize beauty. And if you didn't do that, you could get lost in that chaos because the chaos was every day. And for people that don't understand what this mission was in Laos, what we were doing in Laos, this as Vietnam wound down, this war was building up because we had to bottle up that Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is why these guys were running around on the ground and why we were flying around supporting them. We had to bottle up that Ho Chi Minh Trail to stop the supplies going to the south so that the South Vietnamese army could eventually take over the war. And they didn't do a very good job of it. But we were, I think, there were in excess of 40,000 North Vietnamese troops that were trying to stop what a handful of special forces guys and a couple of guys in little airplanes were doing to them. And so they're to the target, you could take a little time to get in touch with those things that made you human. Once you were over it, then everything that you did narrowed in scope so that your concentration was on this mission and no other distractions. Don't bother me with crap. I got this to think about. I got this to do. Some of the things I didn't have to think about, they were automatic flying the airplane, but other things I did. And so we compartmentalized and we concentrated and we flew that airplane like it was, like I said, like it was a shoe, like I just put on a shirt. And that's what you had to do. Otherwise you were dead.
Yes, sir.
And we knew. So I'm very surprised that I'm sitting here talking to you. I truly am. I mean, I'm very surprised that I got on that airplane and came back from Tanzania to San Francisco
Well,
when I was
I'm honored to be here and to have this conversation, Frank. I mean, and it's been a blast so far. And I mean, at the same time, though, I mean, you're right. The risk incredibly high. I mean, considering the fact that, at the altitude you're flying, you're not wearing a parachute. And with that being said, too, I mean, any mistake you make at treetop level or at low altitude, there's a good chance if you screw up, you're not coming back from it.
No. And we had one rule when we took a guy out to do to ride in our back seat if we didn't know him. And we always told him that we have this is our only rule, and it's one pass and haul ass. So get the photographs you need the first time I go, because I'm not coming back. We're going to go through here, and we're getting out of here. So the only time that we didn't do that, we lost the guy in the back seat. And when I looked at my wingman, I was I was amazed that we had survived because we were in the middle of we were bracketed by two Chinese 51s, and they were banging away at us, and every AK-47 on the face of the earth was shooting at us. And of course, the guy in the back seat had his head blown off, and both our airplanes were pretty well stitched up. One of them was shot up so badly that we had to leave it at Dak To, and I flew back. The guy that I flew this mission with, he and I have never spoken about it. I don't think Phil's ever said the guy in the back seat, the sergeant in the back seat, the photographer. Phil's ever said his name again. So it's that, and you come back and you wonder how guys on either side of us, Phil and me, and another guy, John Myers, another guy, Doug Kraut, how the four of us made it home. And there were guys before us and guys after us that were dead. There were guys that flew this mission that flew it once. One guy on his very first mission got shot down. He managed to put this thing in a bomb crater. He put the airplane in a bomb because the airplane was destroyed, but he in the back seat got out, and they got him out. So the helicopter got him, picked him up, and they got him back. When he got back to Khartoum, it took him maybe 10 minutes to pack his bag. And he was out the door, back down to Holloway, and he became the supply officer. There was another guy that did the same thing. And I can't do this. And no one said, well, you chicken shit or something. Nobody ever did anything like that. This was purely voluntary. We all stood up. We all said we would do it. The only thing that I did not volunteer for was at 2/3 of the way through my tour, I was approached by the CIA to go to work for Air America after I was done, and they would give me a $10,000 bonus, and I would go fly a Porter or whatever the hell they had. And I thought, buddy, you probably chewing up all the good karma that you've got. So I wouldn't be doing that if I were you. And as it turned out, Phil got offered and Kraut got offered, and nobody took him up on it. I ain't going there. Sorry. But that was day to day. Catastrophe was commonplace. Guys were getting blown out of the sky. They could have been in a helicopter. They could have been flying what we were flying. The potential for having it happen was daily. And so going home, I kept saying to myself when I was in Tonson, getting ready to get on an airplane, don't anybody do anything until the wheels are up. Everybody behave until this thing is climbing out, and I'm going because I don't want to. I got stuff to do. It was hard. It was hard, and it was every day, and you just put one foot in front of the other. We had an ops officer, an S3, that just hated us. and I don't know why. And he was furious with Phil, my guy that I was there with, Phil Phillips, and didn't like me much. He and Phil got into an argument. He kicked Phil off the compound, so Phil wound up having to move over to the MACV compound and stay there. But I briefed him on missions when he and I flew together. As the monsoons cranked up, I realized that instead of flying a straight line to a target, I was going to be zigzagging down valleys because I couldn't see squat. Um, and I was going to burn up a lot more gas. And we were going further and further and further over into Laos. So I said to this S3, who was a major, I may have to go to Thailand. And I just want you to know that if I get closed out with these monsoons and the rain and the weather, I got to go to Thailand. And he said, Captain, do you have your map with you? And I said, yeah. And I took it out of my flight suit. I had a big pouch below my knee that you could carry maps in. And I took it out and he proceeded to take it, got a scissors out of his drawer and cut Thailand off of my map. And he said, you're not going to Thailand, Captain. You're not going on R&R. Don't even think about it. And I was furious. Then I walked out of his office and I think it was kind of, it was even raining that day. And I sort of stood there for a minute in the rain thinking about this. And I thought, there's no big deal. Don't get excited about this. I know exactly how to get to Ubon. I know what heading to fly and I know where it is and I know how I'm going to do it. And I'm going to get close and I'm going to call them up and say, hey, I'm lost. Do you see me on the radar? And they will bring me to the airfield and I'll land. And then I'm going to go get a phone and call this bastard up and say, hey, Major, wish you were here, because I'm in Ubon. Never happened. I think the only thing I always wished that I would have had to have diverted there just so that I could make that phone call.
That'd have been one a great phone call to make too. It makes for a hell of a story.
True, but so I rambled a lot. What else?
Well,
You should ask me some questions.
I want to say that you brought up a great point that has been mentioned to me by a World War II fighter pilot that I've interviewed, a B-17 bomber pilot that I've been able to interview, and then a Special Forces operator who was with the 160th SOAR in Global War on Terror. And it was that the aspect of the mission is that you don't focus on the next mission or the next day or a week from now, but when you are given a mission, you focus on the task for that day. Because if your mind is not on that, then any little distraction can cause you to make a mistake that can get you killed, or, and for what a lot of these guys said, more importantly, the people around them killed.
Yep, absolutely. Task at hand. Tunnel vision, compartmentalize, focus, and do what you know how to do. And don't screw around. Don't get fancy. Don't break the rules that you've made for yourself.
Well, and I think it's important. You have to have that. You have to have those boundaries, because if you don't, and if you lose that focus, you become careless in many ways too.
You do. And that's when something comes up to bite you, and you just you're not concentrating on the task at hand. You can be you also got to be lucky. I mean, truly, you could be the greatest pilot in the world again, and the a lucky round comes and takes you out. However, you minimize the chances of that happening by staying true to the parameters that you set up for yourself, and flying it the way you know you're supposed to be flying it, and staying one mission at a time, one day at a time. That otherwise you're all over the place, and that's how you die.
Well, and with that too, I mean, did any of the men that you flew with start to act in that manner to where one of you spoke out and said, "Hey, you're being careless," or you're being taken off flight status for a few days or a few weeks to recover?
There was a guy that preceded me at the Special Forces at FOB 2 up in Khartoum that was brought back to the company because they felt that he was taking too many chances. And the guy's a hell of a pilot. He was a hell of a pilot, and he absolutely believed he was bulletproof, and the company commander didn't think so, and so he wound up being pulled back, and that's when I found myself up there with just two other guys, and we were flying all day, all day, all day. Uh, but yeah, they would, like I said with the guy that was killed in the back of my wingman's airplane. That was the day that a rule was broken because they went back, and the photographer was begging him to go back, and he could have told the guy to shut up. I mean, the guy flying the airplane was a captain. The guy in the back seat with the camera was a sergeant. And so someone ruled the roost in that place, and but he gave in and he went back, and the next thing you know, we've got the world is coming to an end. So, you
Well, and
know,
to eventually get to that as well, I mean, the build up to, your arrival in Vietnam, and to shift some gears, to start asking some of these questions that I've been wanting to ask, is that when did you finally get your orders to go to Vietnam?
uh, about halfway through flight school,
And
and
did you know that you would be flying special forces over Laos?
no, nope, I did not. I did not. I, I volunteered for something without knowing exactly what I was volunteering for, and so there I was.
Now, with that, the volunteering itself, was there extra pay, any kind of incentive for this?
No, no extra pay, no extra training, no dinner, no breakfast.
So you
We
finally
left.
go
Huh?
ahead, friend.
No, we left before sunup, and we got down after the mess hall was closed.
Jesus.
They had a
So
lot of rice.
I was about to ask, I mean, that factors in too with the food situation. I mean, most people don't understand that aspect of these missions, of how late some of them are.
Well, they gave us. I had all the sea rations I could eat, but they were horrible, and some of them had been around since World War II. So yeah, they did. Because I mean, more than once I opened up a one of those olive green cardboard boxes the sea rations came in to find a package of Lucky Strike green, which was that's how they were in there's something about the red dye that they so in during World War II, the packaging they just switched it to green from red with Lucky Strikes. Same thing with Pall Malls, I think. But you always got cigarettes in the sea ration pack. And when they popped out green, these babies had been around for a while. They also gave us bags of rice and dehydrated vegetables and shrimp. And that was actually pretty good. And so that, and, there's a lot of, there, there are a lot of carbohydrates in beer. And so you were, you know, I think that with the rice and the dehydrated vegetables and the beer, you're going to live. And if you didn't like the beer, you could drink scotch.
Good thing for me, I like both. So as you get your orders, flight school comes to an end. You don't take the 30 days leave home. You get on a plane bound for Vietnam. So what was that flight like going to Vietnam, knowing that you're going into a combat zone?
It was dead quiet, and it was a military transport. So I'm flying. I think I was on OAS, uh, which was a charter outfit that's long gone. But I was on it was a DC-8, and I'm pretty sure. At any rate, we left from McCord late at night, and we stopped in Guam, and we spent a couple of hours in Guam, and long enough to get something to eat in a big mess hall, and then get back on the airplane. And I remember sitting there, and I'm a first lieutenant now, and with these guys and these poor privates, Jesus, and they're just jammed in there. Well, we're all jammed in there, but they've got packs and helmets, and they've got rifles and all kinds of crap, and they're sitting there for half their life. It felt like flying to Vietnam. We got into the Trang late at night, and I don't know where they went, but there we were.
So getting off the plane, it's late at night. What's the first sense that you gather when you step off the plane? The smell, the heat?
All the above. It's hotter than hell, even though it's at night. There are a gazillion mosquitoes everywhere, and you definitely knew that you were somewhere that you'd never been before because of the smell of it was hit you right between the eyes or right on the nose, um, but it was unmistakable. And so eventually you got used to it and you stopped smelling it. And but initially it just almost floored you. And the density of the air, the heaviness of it, you certainly knew that you were around the corner from the equator.
Well, certainly. I mean, with that as well, I know a lot of the guys I've talked to, all of them mentioned the heat, but also worst of all, for many of them was the smell of just this stench of, for many of them described it as the rotting jungle, but also as what was being used as manure and just being in a new place. It's different.
All the above, all of it. Yeah, all the above. And like I say, eventually you do get used to it, but you kind of stop smelling it because it was every day. But that's
So plane lands, and then immediately, what's the next step for Frank Doherty? You go get your orders, and your orders take you where?
I initially was sent up to a place called Quinyon, and I checked into the 18th Aviation Company, and they flew big single engine otters. So I spent 3 weeks at Fort Ord before I left for Vietnam, learning how to fly this airplane. And it carried 10 passengers, and it was two guys up front and a crew chief in the back. And we flew up and down the coast. I was sent up to Da Nang. There was a platoon up there, and we flew up to the DMZ, and then we flew back down about as far south as Quin Yon, making a bunch of stops along the way. And we were cargo hauler, freight hauler, passengers, and then every Saturday morning we did a thing called the VC shuttle where we carried prisoners.
The
And
VC shuttle.
that's it. There it is. And so that airplane was a lot of fun to fly, and you'll see them still up in Alaska and up in the bush in Canada, and a lot of them have been converted to turboprops, so the nose is different. It's more pointed. That actually is kind of a neat airplane, and but the mission itself was one you just wanted to blow your brains out. It was just so boring. And so it took me about 3 weeks to figure out that I didn't really want to do this. And so I bailed. I talked my way out of the unit, and I think that the company commander there thought he was punishing me by sending me up to a bird dog unit.
And
It's
so
exactly what I wanted.
when you talk your way out of this, how quickly do you find yourself being transferred to flying bird dogs? Was it a couple of
That
days?
day, that
Wow.
day, that day. Company commander said, I don't want anybody in my unit that doesn't want to be here. He said, you'll fly up to the den, get your stuff. Somebody's going to take you to to Camp Holloway, but south of Pleiku. Get out of my office.
And so
So I did.
immediately you're packing your bags.
Oh yeah. See ya.
So bags are packed, and now we're just south of Pleiku. And so when you get to this new unit, what unit is it?
It's the 219th Aviation Company, the Headhunters. And I walked in and checked in, and the company clerk greeted me, and then this guy Don Ship, who was 6'2" and 250 pounds. He was an offensive lineman for the University of Texas, Arlington. One of the biggest guys I've ever seen in my life. Comes in and he says, welcome, and yak, yak, yak. And he said, what do you want to do? And I said, what do you mean what do I want to do? And he said, well, I got a couple of jobs here. And one is you'll be here, you'll be in the fourth platoon, you'll do artillery adjustment, you'll work for the fourth division, you'll fly mortar watch and convoy cover and road recon, and then you're going to have this extra duty and this extra duty and this extra duty. And I said, well, what's the other job? And he said, well, you'll go up to the second platoon in Khartoum. And I said, well, what are the extra duties up there? And he said, well, I don't think there are any. And I said, well, I'll go do that. So that's how I wound up there. And I got dropped off in front of this compound outside of town that was not guarded by Vietnamese. It was guarded by Nungs, who were ethnic Chinese that were born in Vietnam. And they were mercenaries. And I talked to Colonel Frank App, and he, not Frank, I forget what his first name was, but Colonel Apt, and made small talk, walked me over to the S2. That's the intel officer. And I got a top secret briefing and had to sign a piece of paper saying I would not talk about what I was doing. And then I looked at this big map and I realized that Vietnam wasn't on it. And Laos was up there and Cambodia was down there. And here's the border and here's these rivers. And he's going on about this place and that place. And I'm thinking, holy crap. I'm not flying in Vietnam. It's what happened? What did I just do? And he explained the mission. And I thought, you idiot, you've just, but as it turned out, first of all, I said I'd do it. And second of all, there's no, if you stand up and raise your hand, you're going to do what you say you're going to do. There was no going home. I don't want to do this. King's X, I lied. No, that, I said I would, I'm going to do it, see it through. So off I went. And next thing you know, I'm flying over Laos.
Well, and it brings up the question. I mean, I know a lot of the SOG operators, they had to sign a 20-year non-disclosure. Did you have a certain time window for where you were not allowed to talk about your missions?
Yeah, that was it.
20 years.
Yep.
So we get this, and you're at this new unit, working with the 219th. How quickly are you flying missions once you get there?
The next day.
And what's that first mission for Frank Doherty?
That was flying. I was just talking to John Myers about this, because Myers and I flew together, and Myers was on his way back down to company because he was the guy that was taking too many chances. And anyway, we flew over into Laos, and we're flying along this river, and there's a double loop in the river like this. So in my top secret briefing, this place was called the Bra. Well, the Bra was wall to wall anti-aircraft stuff. I mean, it was one of the most well-defended areas that the North Vietnamese had in Laos. And here we are flying along. And Myers said, now look, don't turn around and look at anything. Just keep going. Because if you turn and look like this, you're going to turn the airplane and you're going to do this and they're going to shoot you down. He said, and I don't want them to shoot you down. So don't look. So we just kept going. Oh my God, what have I done? So anyway, but when we did it, it was looking at the area. We flew this day at about 1,500 feet. So we were out of small arms range, but not out of the bigger guns, but nobody cranked up on us. And then the next day we did the real thing.
Well,
so
one of the things I want to point out too, I mean, with a bird dog, I mean, we're not talking about a A1 Sky Raider in terms of the punishment it can take. Bird dog is a small aircraft. I mean, due to the lightweightness of it, did you have any armor on it to protect you or any of the engine or fuel lines?
No, we supposedly had an armored seat, and I don't know how armored it was. I did carry a parachute. If I was never high enough to jump, but I figured it would help stop around coming up through the back. I sat on a flak vest. I kept my pistol. My initially I had a shoulder holster which I got rid of, and I got a regular holster, and I put that gun between my legs, so I had protection from the top and the bottom, so to speak. And then I had my Car 15. But armor, there wasn't any. We had one good thing we had in the airplane was self-sealing tanks. So the tanks were lined with a neoprene that would collapse on a hole, and it would prevent your fuel from leaking out. And that was a big deal because if I had gas, I could get back to where I needed to go. If I had something shot up on the airplane, I kind of figured I could fly it. Unless they shot a whole wing off, but they could take half a wing, I could still fly it. They could take part of the horizontal stabilizer, I could still fly it. They could also shoot out my cables and I could still fly it. But my control cables to my ailerons or to my rudder, I could still fly the airplane. So, but there was nothing armored. I mean, it was the flight vest.
The tin can.
Yeah, that was it.
Well, and two, I mean, thinking about it, that first flight that you get, of course, looking down at the bra, I mean, I know that's got to be one of the most beautiful views you've seen as well of how majestic the countryside really is.
Well, I think what I was impressed by was the way John talked about it, and it was this area when you looked at it was pretty well bombed, so it was a lot of craters and a lot of bomb craters. So the Air Force was doing a number on the terrain. I mean, they were turning this place into a moonscape in some areas. This was one of them. There were other areas where there was nothing out there but jungle, and you could see rivers and waterfalls. And I saw a tiger once. I used to see elephants every now and then.
Wow.
It was all very cool, and lots and lots of birds. But it could turn lethal in a heartbeat. Just depends on what you stumbled on, and you stumbled on a lot.
Well, and I was about to ask, thinking of your flight patterns that you would take, of course, on these missions, would you know about other flight routes of F4s or B-52s that were bombing through the region so you knew to avoid any of the falling bombs?
We actually did bomb damage assessment from B-52 strikes, and we hung around right on the edge of the area of operations, and we were in as that last bomb blew up. And so where the hell was I talking to a guy named Pete Johnson, who was there before me flying this thing, and he made a mistake and wound up flying essentially trying to fly ahead of where the B-52s were dropping. So I'm going to have to ask just to pause it for just a second. I got to take the puppies out for a minute.
Sure.
I'll be ready. There are two of them. Thank you.
Welcome.
They were due.
So back to flying just some of these missions. I mean, I guess it'd be pretty frequently that, you would just see fighters and of course as well doing the BDA assessments pretty frequently just on your flights, correct?
Yeah, and we also used fighters that we could get when we acquired a target, and so I put in a lot of Phantoms and Sky Raiders for the most part. A couple times F-100s. I forget what their call sign was, but nails coming out of I think around, it wasn't Phan Rang. I think it came out of Thailand, but we then the B-52 strikes, and those were all part of the missions that we ran, and so I found a whole section of the trail that was a bunch of bridges, and I got some F4s to come in and blow a couple of them. Just, it was, but it was every day. I mean, whatever you saw, whatever you did, and sometimes you had to ask permission, and sometimes you were able to do whatever you needed to do.
Well, and with that too, I mean, you're seeing the shock and awe of American air power at its tip. I mean, we're looking, 69, we're looking at the newest marvels of technology. I mean, it's got to be, you know, jaw-dropping at the same time, but also terrifying to realize the magnitude of power that these aircraft have.
Well, that's all true, but on the other on the other side of the coin of all this was that somehow um, these guys on the receiving end of this managed to survive a lot of it somehow, burrow deep into the ground, whatever they were doing, maybe getting information as to where the strike was going to take place. Maybe they knew ahead of time. I don't know. But I do know that BDA was bad because there was just as much chance of these guys coming up out of the ground like angry ants as there were that you killed a bunch of them. So you just never knew what was going to happen when you got down in the weeds, trying to take photographs of what you thought you blew up. Um, and I can't explain it any better than that, Zach. I don't know exactly how. It always amazed me how anybody could live through a B-52 strike. I mean, I don't care how far underground you were burrowed. I don't know. I just don't know. And they had there was a bomb that they could drop to clear an area to make an LZ that would, I mean, it would just a whole like a football field. It was just huge. So I don't know.
I've talked to many Marines and of course recently just getting involved with Terry and of course the same reason. It's like, it's you can't fathom how someone can survive a bomb strike from a B-52, but yet they do, just due to the burrowing, the tunnels, and to think about what it must be like underground as that's going off. I mean, that's enough to make you go crazy if you're just constantly being bombed. Has to
No,
be.
no.
But I wanted to take today to through our first interview of that second mission where you're actually now flying, not at 1,500 feet, but now things are slightly different. So how is mission two different from mission one through the eyes of Frank Doherty?
Well, um, I think that if I remember correctly, on that second mission, it was a dual ship mission, and Mars and I flew together again, and I uh, I did what I was told to do, and I flew at a particular altitude that he said I should be at, and he said this is what I want you to do, and that's what I did. And I think essentially what I was doing was I was covering him, and as he did what he was doing, he was talking to me and explaining it. And so now I thought, oh, now I understand now. I see now. And then we talked more that night about. So what was different about the mission? Up until that day, I don't think that I had concentrated so hard on anything in my life and and tried to stay aware with my eyes open and not miss anything. Just paying absolute attention. And so, yeah, that's what made it different. The first time out with the flying at 1,500 feet, you're kind of all googly eyed and, oh, wow. And here I am over Laos and look at that and look at this. But this was the kind of like the real deal. And so there was nothing was forgotten on this mission or missed on this mission. There was ground fire. There was bobbing and weaving. There was stuff. And so John was a real education for me in just a few short hours the night before, and then until he left, when he went back down to company, and I picked his brain. What
Well,
do I do here? What do I do there?
um,
But
speaking of John, he's a wealth of knowledge. I mean, and it's an outstanding mentor to have, but I can't fathom to be flying a mission that John is and walking you through the mission as he's doing it. That kind of nerve and calm while taking ground fire speaks volumes of the man.
what you'll find, what we both said the same thing, and I was surprised. I never really brought it up to anyone else before, but I asked him just recently, um, when were you the calmest? And he said, when it was at its worst. Because if you didn't concentrate, if you didn't zero in and compartmentalize and narrow your focus down to the job at hand, you were going to get all screwed up. He said, so it didn't bother me until after. And after is when he said, this is when I felt fear. It was after. And I said, I think that I felt it. I mean, I got sweaty and, but, and I had an upset stomach, but that was usually an after effect of the mission. And so, we were in agreement there. You're, you do, it does get profoundly quiet. And it's just a zeroing in of concentration. I mean, I can't explain it any other way, but I I think the only time I felt myself wondering if I was going to be able to control what was happening around me was when we lost that photographer, and I knew it, and I knew what was happening, and I had to try to figure out how to fly us both out of this, because the guy with the photographer in the back seat had his aileron shot out and had his the cable back to his tail wheel severed, and he didn't know whether or not he was also hit, because apparently the round that hit the photographer sprayed blood everywhere, blood and his brains. And so it was, I mean, that was
Well,
as close to being on the edge of not having a grip on everything.
well, and I just find it phenomenal of how you keep that mindset. I mean, it's incredible. And I know that the book's going to be even more amazing as I finally get into it in detail. But from your perspective, being in the bird dog too, this first mission, you're taking ground fire. Ground fire's coming up. What does that sound like in a bird dog?
It in the bird, if you look at the photograph of the bird dog, you can see like they got big side windows. They 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 attach to the other side of the wing. We always flew with those windows open. When a round went by you, if a round hit you, you'd hear it, boing, and you'd feel it in the airplane. The airplane responded to taking a round. If it went by you outside that window, it snapped when it went by. And so it was almost like they had a Zippo lighter, which they were ubiquitous in Vietnam, and you snap the lid open and it would go crack, and you would hear that thing go by you. And the other thing that you would see, because every fifth round on an AK was a tracer, and the NVA shot green tracers. And so everything coming up at us was green. Anything that I fired, if I had tracers in my magazines, and I did, they would be red. So it was like Christmas morning. but, but it was green coming up. And so, you knew where you were, and you could tell by the amount of green you saw just how many of them were down there, and how they were shooting at you. Um, that's that's what you knew.
Well,
and you were moving. I mean, you didn't. Nobody flew straight and level. You were an idiot if you did that. I'm doing this and I'm doing this and whatever I could make that airplane do, I was doing.
Well, with that, I mean, the concentration, the flying, the maneuvers, but also at the same time, I know when I sent you the document for some of the first questions I had for this first interview, I think what struck me the most was what you talk about the sweat in your eyes and dripping off your face from the concentration.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's hot, but now it's even hotter, and so you've got the windows open, and that helped. But fear manifests itself in a lot of different ways. You don't just because I'm sweating doesn't mean I'm going to succumb to it. But I think that it was a reaction. I know that there was an incident that took place at the Special Forces camp called Doc Siang, where I caught a guy in the open and actually hit him with a rocket and killed him. And I watched it, and I felt physically ill from that. But um, that was an instantaneous response. Uh, when I knew that when I could see the tracers coming up, I concentrated on not letting them hit me and doing what I was supposed to do, complete this mission, finish it. Um, so I mean, I wish I could explain it to you a different way, but I can't.
Frank, no, that's
Um,
perfect, my friend. I mean, it just leaves me with the question, and you've mentioned this several times that you flew with your wheels in the treetops. Were you ever picking out any twigs from the wheels?
oh hell yes. You actually that also took a tremendous amount of concentration because you did want to fly skimming the tops of those of that jungle canopy, but you didn't really get. I mean, if you were 5 feet above the canopy or 10 feet above the canopy, you had to be paying attention because it wasn't flat. I mean, so you were flying a little bit of map of the earth, and really, I mean, you were involved. I mean, you were just in it. It
So when the mission ends, and whether it's mission one or two, you land. What's the response then? Do you go have a beer? Do you go have a scotch? Well, what do you do?
all the above, and you 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 have a beer. You go and eventually you go take a shower and hope that the water is turned on in the showers because sometimes the special forces compound they turn the damn water off. Usually there was oh, yeah usually there was a faucet. If nothing else, you get a washcloth and hose yourself off. I found that that would help, and then I would um, eventually eventually have something to eat. And when I was, maybe Phil and I or Doug and I or John and I talked about stuff, and we didn't necessarily always talk about the mission. We talked about other things. Um, and we but just kind of wound down. And even if the water was lukewarm and if it was a shower, I mean, I could stand there for days and just try to get the day off of me, scrub it off of me. Um, so that's what you did. And did I drink? I drank too much. I don't. I told somebody not long ago when they offered me a single malt scotch, and I said, actually, I've drank my worldly allotment of scotch in a year. And he said, "What year was that?" And I said, "The one when I was in Asia. I drank my scotch, drank all the scotch I'm allowed to have." But it was just you could buy scotch, you could buy a bottle of Johnny Walker Red for $3 a bottle.
Wow.
Yeah. So it we just, but I don't I don't recall nights. In fact, I can't recall a night where I actually sat and drank so much scotch that I was just drunk out of my mind. I remember drinking rice wine at a when the Montyards were serving that shit, and I thought I'd been poisoned, but alcohol poisoning, and the hangover lasted 3 days. But and then one other time when Phillips and I went up to the Stone Elephant in Da Nang because we stood down when Scenic was overthrown. We went there and Phil ate 5 dinners and I ate three, and each one came with a bottle of wine. And we drank them all. So and that was a funny night. That was a great night, but I have to laugh. But no, I don't. I drank, and but I didn't. I never had to be carried anywhere. I wasn't stumbled down drunk, and the night that I got promoted to captain, I got a glass full of everything that was behind the bar that they poured in and put my wings down the bottom, my captain's bars down the bottom. I had to chug what was in that glass to catch the captain's bars in my teeth. I did. Colonel App pinned them on. I excused myself, walked outside, and threw up.
Ah,
You know, yeah. I said, this is part of the deal here, the hazing, becoming a captain. Well, I'm not keeping this stuff in me because I'm going to be sick as a dog and I got to get up in a couple hours and go flying. So nobody's let me off the hook about that. Take the day off. Nah, not happening. Never happened. So no, I just went out and puked. But that's how you wound down. I mean, that's what you did.
well, and I won't take too much more of your time today, but it brings to the winding down. It's 1969. What kind of music are you listening to when you got
Creedence Clearwater, the Beatles, Creedence Clearwater, and when I used to love to go out on the bunker line at night, and I would go up on myself and I would sit on a bunker and look up at the stars and just think about stuff. And the bunkers were manned by these same guys, these nuns, and I used to sing Susie Q as I approached the bunker so they'd know it was me and they wouldn't shoot me. And I always went to the same bunker and I always sang the same song, and they knew who I was. And I became friends with one particular guy who had a gold tooth, and we the only two words we or actually three that we ever spoke to one another. I thought maybe he knew some French, so as I went out there one night, I said "Bonsoir, mon ami." That's four, and he said "Bonsoir, mon ami." So he'd been there when the French were there, and so he understood that. But that was as far as we got. And but it was just I it was Creedence Clearwater, it was the Beatles. There was there were a couple of other odd groups, a group called Lion, and but that was the music. And of course the other guys, there were a lot of guys that played country western, but I must admit I was never a fan until I heard Toby Keith, and then I became a fan, and Vince Gill, and but I that was it. That was the music that I would listen to. And we had tape decks, so we could listen to well, Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and I was still back at the Fillmore in San Francisco with my music.
I've heard a lot about the Fillmore in San Francisco relating to the Grateful Dead. I'm a big Grateful Dead fan, so
Well, I saw them. They used to pull up flatbed trucks over to the Panhandle of Golden Gate on Sundays and run wires across Fell Street and plug into somebody's apartment. The bands would play. I saw Janice and I saw Gracie Slick in the airplane, and the great and Pigpen and Garcia and the whole gang. It was
man,
great. It was free. It was all free.
sounds like we're gonna have a later interview about the music experience that you had in San Francisco, because I could talk about that for hours.
It was
Well, and to finish out our day today, the last question I have for you is that with your time there, and one of the things that I like to do with the first interview with veterans is to talk about a very humorous experience to end the first interview on a good note, something that's just funny, that stand out, that really just was one of the more humorous sides of the conflict that you saw. So, what stands out in your head there, Frank?
Um, there was there was over in Laos, there was a radio relay station called Leghorn, and it was up on a pinnacle, and the North Vietnamese would try to get to it every chance they got, and they could never get all the way up the damn thing. So I was out there um, flying around Leghorn looking for mortars that we knew they were pulling up this hill. Meanwhile, the King Bees, that's the Vietnamese, the VNAF 219th, and they flew the CH-34s. They were in resupplying Leghorn. And I'm watching this operation, and a King Bee would come in, and the door would open, and they toss out a rocket box or a box, a box, one. And then they would fly away. Another one would come in, and the door would open, they'd toss out another box. So there's a daisy chain of these King Bees throwing off one box at a time. Then they'd all fly away, and they'd all come back, and be one more box, one more box, one more box. I finally asked Mike Buckland, who was ran Photoshop while I was there. He took over from Frank Greco at CCC, and I said, Bucky, what the hell's going on up there? And he said, well, they're resupplying Leghorn. And I said, yeah, one box at a time. He said, they get $5 a pop for crossing the border. I'd only take one box too. but but the what was so crazy was this day, I'm flying around looking for the mortars, watching these King Bees, and I see this guy standing on the side of the mountain, and he's got an orange panel. He's waving it up and down and jumping up and down and waving at me. And if I could, if I knew Rade, I could probably link lip sync, because he was yelling at me something, and I realized this guy's a yard. He's a mutton yard. He fell off the mountain. He probably fell off in his sleep, and he's down, and he doesn't know how to get back up again. And so I'm looking at him, and I thought, this is just the most bizarre damn thing I'd ever seen. So I got one of the King Bees came in, and they picked him up, and I never did get to meet him, but I figured if I ever did, I'd have a new best friend, because we plucked him out. Meanwhile, the North, they start lobbing mortars up, and now the King Bees come flying down, and these guys were nutheads. And so they get the big side door in that helicopter, and they catch the North Vietnamese with their mortars and chase them down the hill. And I think they left the mortars where they were. And the King Bee shot the place up, and then they went back to resupplying like nothing happened at $5 a pop for every mission they flew that day. I thought I should have been doing that. I should have gotten $5 for every time I crossed the border. I'd be rich. But that struck me as just bizarre. There were other things that happened, but that one always just stayed with me. I looked at that guy standing on the side of the hill waving his orange paddle. I thought, you're the luckiest guy on the face of the earth, pal. It just saved your life.
Wow. That's
You
it.
know,
You can't make it up. I mean, where else do you hear a story like that?
it was just funny. It was just funny. There were some great funny things that occurred, but that one has always stayed with me.
Well, Frank, I think it's brilliant. I think this has been one hell of a first interview, truth be told. And I'm excited to see where this is going to go. But I always end my interviews with this thank you for your service and welcome home, Frank.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Zach, and I really appreciate being able to talk about, and eventually we will, this very small group of very special guys that I flew with, that I would have given my life for. They were that important to me and still are. We, as my father said to me years later, one of the few times he actually, with emotion, talked about World War II. And he put his hands on my shoulders and he said, we survived, Frankie, we survived. And he was right. And that's so.
Well, and one of the beautiful things about that, I've been talking to a couple of Marines lately who are in way and Global War on Terror vet, and the aspect of surviving, and then of course you end up willing to be interviewed by me. It's whether 100 people see it or 1,000 people see this video, you're carrying on the legacy for those who are no longer here, and that memory continues on and for the eternity. It allows other people to be educated about what really happened over there.
And we were a very small group. I mean, we're talking about a little more than a dozen pilots that flew this mission, and we were the only ones. And so the chance to tell that story, the one that nobody knows, uh, except for them, they do kind of. I think it's an honor, and so I'm honored to be here, and I appreciate your giving me a platform to do this.
Well, it's my honor, Frank, in itself. And with that, I'm going to pause the recording and then you and I'll do a little business talk real quick.